Cold rain washed the mud of Black Creek, pooling around the boots of men, bidding on a human life. Christa stood on the whiskey barrel, shivering in a threadbare dress, her eyes fixed on the grey sky. She wasn't looking at the leering faces or the gold coins tossed on the dirt. She was thinking of her 2 starving brothers hidden in a barn. Then a voice cut through the clamour. Low, growly, and final. The mountain man had spoken. Rain fell in heavy grey sheets, turning the main thoroughfare of Black Creek into a churning trench of mud. Men huddled under the eaves of the saloon, their coat collars turned up against the biting chill, spitting brown streams of tobacco juice into the puddles. It was mid-November. Winter was already breathing down the necks of the valley, and the mood in town was as foul as the weather. Christopher Flores stood on a makeshift wooden platform constructed from 2 empty whiskey barrels and a rotting plank. Her boots were worn completely through the soles. The damp cold seeped up from the wood straight into her bones, making her knees shake. She clenched her jaw until her teeth ached, staring over the heads of the gathered crowd. She refused to look at them. If she looked at them, she would see the hunger in their eyes, the base calculation of men weighing her worth in gold eagles and silver dollars. Her father had been dead for exactly 4 days. A logging accident. A falling widowmaker had crushed his chest, leaving Christa and her 2 younger brothers with a mountain of debt owed to Jebediah Rooker. Rooker owned the saloon, the general store, and half the paper in Black Creek. He didn't wait for the body to cool before he came collecting. When Christa told him there was no money, Rooker had simply smiled. A thin, greasy pulling of his lips. He told her she had assets. She had herself. The alternative was sending the boys to the county orphanage, a place known mostly for dysentery and shallow graves. So she made the deal. She stood on the wood. $3, a man shouted from the back. He smelled like sour mash and unwashed wool. $3 for a girl with all her teeth and a back strong enough to haul wash water. Rooker scoffed, pacing in front of the platform. He flicked his cigar onto the mud. You insult me, Higgins. I'm owed $50 for her daddy's bar tab alone. We ain't stopping till I see 40. Christa kept her hands folded over her stomach. She wore a faded grey wool dress patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem. It offered almost no protection from the wind. Rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. She felt a single tear break free from the corner of her eye, hot and humiliating, tracking a clean line down her dirt-smudged face. She blinked, rapidly furious with herself. She could not cry. Crying was weakness. If she was going to be bought, she had to endure it like iron. Across the street, standing under the overhang of the livery stable, G. Sullivan adjusted the leather strap of his pack. G. did not come to town often. Twice a year, maybe 3 times if the salt ran low. He lived high up in the jagged teeth of the mountains, where the air was thin and men were scarce. He was a massive man, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle earned through a lifetime of felling trees and dragging carcasses through heavy snow. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his eyes were the color of hammered steel. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a grizzly he had killed 3 winters prior. The fur mattered with the morning's rain. He had just sold 50 prime beaver plues and a dozen wolf skins. His pockets were heavy with coin, and his pack was loaded with coffee flour, salt pork, and gunpowder. He was ready to leave. He hated the stench of Black Creek. He hated the noise, the cramped buildings, the desperate, grasping nature of the people who lived in the lands. He turned his back on the crowd, intending to walk his mules up the trail, but the wind shifted, carrying Rooker's booming voice. $15 come now, boys. She's quiet. She won't give you no lip. Look at them hands. She knows how to work. 20. My G paused. He turned his head, slowly peering through the curtain of rain. He saw the girl. She looked small on that platform, fragile like a bird caught in a snare. But it wasn't her frailty that made him stop. It was the absolute, crushing stoicism in her posture. She was terrified. He could see it in the rigid set of her shoulders, yet she stood tall. And then he saw the tear. Just one. It caught the dull light of the grey sky as it fell. "Two!" yelled a miner from the front row. A man missing half an ear. "Two going once!" Rooker called out, grinning. G didn't think about it. If he thought about it, he would have grabbed his mules and walked away. He had no use for a woman. His cabin was built for one man. His life was solitary by design. But the thought of that girl walking away with the half-eared miner, or any of the other vermin standing in the mud, tied a knot of cold anger in his gut. He stepped out from under the livery overhang. His heavy boots sucked at the mud. The crowd parted instinctively as he moved through them. The mountain man carried an aura of quiet violence, a sudden heavy presence that made the drunken townsfolk shuffle backward. He stopped at the edge of the platform. Rooker looked down at him, his greasy smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Well now," Rooker said, recovering. "Sullivan didn't figure you for a family man. You want a bid?" G reached into the heavy leather pouch at his hip. He didn't count the coins. He pulled out a heavy handful of gold double eagles and slapped them down onto the wet plank beside Christa's boots. The metal clinked dull and heavy against the wood. Rooker's eyes bulged. The crowd went dead silent. There was at least 80 $80 sitting on the board. A fortune. $80, G said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together. "Take it or leave it, Rooker." Rooker stared at the gold, licking his lips. "Sold." He breathed quickly, sweeping the coins into his hat before G could change his mind. "She is yours, Sullivan. Free and clear." Christa looked down at the massive man in the bare coat. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had traded one monster for another, but as she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the leering hunger of the townsfolk. She saw nothing but a vast, terrifying emptiness. "Get down," G said. Christa stepped off the barrel. Her legs gave way. She expected him to let her fall into the mud. Instead, a massive hand caught her by the elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. His grip was firm, his calluses thick and hard like wood. "Where are your things?" he asked. "I don't have things," Christa whispered, her voice. "I have my brothers." G stared at her for a long moment. He didn't blink. Then he gave a short, stiff nod. "Show me." The barn behind Rooker's general store smelled of rot old hay and horse manure. Rain dripped steadily through the sagging roof. Christa pushed the heavy wooden door open, her hands shaking. G stood behind her, silent as a shadow despite his size. "Sam Toby." Christa called out softly. There was a rustle in the darkest corner of the stall. Two boys emerged from beneath a pile of mouldy horse blankets. Sam at 12 was tall and painfully thin, holding a pitchfork with white-knuckled desperation. Toby 8 huddled behind his older brother, his eyes wide and terrified. "Christa?" Sam asked, his voice cracking. He lowered the pitchfork slightly when he saw her, but raised it again when G stepped into the dim light. "Who is that?" "Put it down, Sam." Clear's throat, Christa said, stepping forward quickly. She wrapped her arms around both of them, burying her face in Toby's messy hair. She felt the sharp ridges of their spines beneath their thin shirts. They hadn't eaten a full meal in almost a week. "It's all right, we're leaving." "With him?" Sam asked, glaring at G. "With me?" G answered. He didn't try to soften his voice. He looked at the boys, assessing them. the way he might assess a pair of newborn calves, scrawny, weak, but alive. Gather whatever you own. We have 10 or mai of uphill walking before the snow starts. Snow! Christa looked up, alarmed. Down in the valley it was just rain. The treine is freezing over, G said flatly. We leave now or we freeze in the dark. Move. He didn't wait to see if they obeyed. He turned and walked out of the barn. 10 minutes later, they were at the edge of town. G had 2 mules loaded with supplies. He didn't offer a ride to Christa or the boys. The mules were carrying maximum weight, and mountain trails were treacherous. He handed Christa a thick wool blanket from his pack. Tear it in 3, he instructed. Wrap it around your shoulders. Christa didn't argue. She ripped the heavy fabric draping a piece over Sam, another, Clear's throat, over Toby, and taking the last for herself. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried blood, but it cut the bitter wind. They began the climb. The trail was nothing more than a deer path, cutting sharply through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The rain slowly turned to sleet, stinging their faces like tiny shards of glass. The ground grew harder, the mud giving way to frozen earth and slick rocks. Christa walked behind G, the boys trailing her. Her boots, already worn through, offered no traction and no warmth. Her feet went numb within the first hour. By the second hour, she could feel the warm, wet stickiness of blisters bursting and bleeding against the cold leather. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, forcing herself to keep putting one foot in front of the other. She would not complain. She belonged to this man now. Complaining was for people who had rights. Sam stumbled, catching himself on a tree root. He gasped, rubbing his knee. G stopped. He didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, a massive silhouette against the grey woods. Christa froze her heart, leaping into her throat. She expected him to shout to strike the boy for slowing them down. Men like Rooker beat dogs and children for far less. Instead, G walked back down the trail. He knelt in front of Sam. "Leg?" G asked. "I'm fine," Sam said defensively, trying to stand up, but wincing. G didn't argue. He reached into his pack and pulled out a coil of rope and a small sack of dried apples. He handed the apples to Toby. "Eat," he ordered. Then he looked at Christa's feet. He noticed the blood staining the wet leather. He didn't say a word. He stood up, unbuttoned his massive bear-skin coat, and shrugged it off. He was left wearing only a heavy canvas shirt and a leather vest. He draped the enormous fur coat over the back of one of the mules. "Put the small one on the mule beneath the coat," G said to Christa. "You and the older boy hold on to the saddle straps. Let the animal pull you up the steep parts. You'll freeze," Christa said. The words slipping out before she could stop them. G met her eyes. His gaze was unreadable. "I don't freeze," he said. He turned back to the trail. The ascent became a grueling test of endurance. The sleet turned to heavy wet snow, coating the pine branches and turning the forest into a silent white world. Christa's lungs burned with the thinning air. Her legs felt like lead, but she held on to the mule's leather strap, letting the sturdy animal drag her forward. Every time she thought she couldn't take another step, she looked at the broad back of the mountain man ahead of her, pushing through the snow without a single word of complaint. He didn't check on them again, but he kept his pace slow enough for them to follow. As twilight began to choke the light from the sky, the trees finally broke. Before them sat a clearing, and in the center, built against the solid rock of the mountainside, was a cabin. It was made of thick, unpeeled logs. The roof pitched sharply to shed snow. It looked strong. It looked like a fortress. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. G had clearly banked the fire before he left for town. "We're here," G said. It was the first time he had spoken in 3 hours. Christa practically collapsed against the side of the mule. They had survived the climb, but as she looked at the heavy timber door of the cabin, a new, colder terror washed over her. The physical journey was over. Now the debt had to be paid. Inside the cabin was a single, large room. It was stark, but impeccably clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, radiating a deep, dormant heat. There was a heavy oak table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and in the far corner, a large bed covered in furs. The walls were adorned with trapped snowshoes, and a Henry repeating rifle hung above the door. G wasted no time. Clear his throat. He moved to the fireplace, tossing in a handful of kindling and blowing the banked embers into a crackling flame. Then he threw on 3 large, split logs of dry ash. The fire roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the timber walls. "Bring them to the hearth," G told Christa, shrugging off his wet vest. Christa guided Sam and Toby to the stone hearth. The boys sank to the floor, holding their trembling hands out toward the flames. The sudden heat was almost painful on their frozen skin. Christa stood behind them, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was shivering violently, her wet dress clinging to her skin like a layer of ice. G walked over to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out a thick, oversized flannel shirt and a pair of woolen long johns. He walked back to Christa and thrust the clothing against her chest. "Get out of the wet clothes," he said. "Behind the blanket." He pointed to a canvas tarp strung up across a corner of the room, clearly used as a crude changing screen. Christa took the clothes. They smelled of cedar and lye soap. She went behind the canvas, peeling off the soaked, ruined dress and the frozen boots. Her fingers were stiff, fumbling with the buttons. When she pulled the flannel shirt over her head, it fell all the way to her knees. It was warm. It felt like a physical embrace, and for a moment she closed her eyes, fighting back the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. When she emerged, G was at the stove. He had a cast-iron skillet, hissing with thick cuts of salted pork and a pot of beans bubbling beside it. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory. Toby was staring at the stove, his mouth literally hanging open. "Sit," G commanded. He plated the food onto tin dishes and set them on the oak table. Christa and the boys sat. G didn't join them right away. He stood by the fire, drinking water from a tin cup, watching them. "Eat slow," he warned Toby, who was shoveling the beans into his mouth. "You'll bring it right back up if you swallow it whole." Christa ate. The food was incredible, salty, hot and heavy. It settled in her hollow stomach like a warm stone. She watched her brothers eat, watching the color slowly return to their pale cheeks. For the first time in weeks they were safe. They were warm. They were full. A profound sense of gratitude weared with the dread sitting heavy in her chest. By the time they finished, the boys could barely keep their eyes open. G pulled a stack of heavy wool blankets from a shelf and made a pallet on the floor near the hearth. The boys collapsed onto it, asleep before G had even finished tucking the top blanket over their shoulders. The cabin grew painfully quiet. The only sound was the popping of the fire and the wind howling against the log walls outside. G was sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair by the stove, running an oiled rag over the mechanism of a hunting knife. He looked up at Christa. She was standing by the table, her hands clutched tightly in front of her. "There's water in the basin," G said, nodding toward a washstand. "You can clean up." Christa nodded slowly. She walked to the basin, splashed cold water on her face, and washed the grime from her hands and neck. She dried herself with a clean towel. She looked at her reflection in the dark window pane. She looked haggarded, a ghost of the girl she had been before her father died. She turned around. G was still sitting there waiting. It was time. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing the tremor out of her limbs. She walked across the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She stopped 2 feet from his chair. He looked up, his steel-grey eyes locking onto hers. He didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He just watched. Christa raised her hands to the top button of the oversized flannel shirt. Her fingers shook slightly as she undid the first button, then the second. The shirt parted, revealing the pale skin of her collarbone. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. She reached for the third button. "What are you doing?" The voice was harsh. It sounded like a whip cracking in the quiet room. Christa flinched, her hands dropping to her sides. She looked up, startled. G was leaning forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in a dark scowl. Christa swallowed hard. "I'm paying my debt." G stood up. He towered over her, casting a massive shadow across the floor. Christa squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. Instead of grabbing her, G reached out and grabbed the collar of the flannel shirt. With a quick, rough motion, he pulled the fabric together, closing the gap over her chest. His knuckles brushed lightly against her collarbone. The contact was startlingly brief, completely void of lust. "Button that up," he ordered, his voice low and hard. Christa opened her eyes. She was shaking again, but not from the cold. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You bought me for $80. You bought me at an auction?" "I bought a ledger," G said, stepping back, putting space between them. "I paid Rooker the money your father owed him. I don't buy people." Christa stared at him, her chest heaving. The sheer, impossible reality of what he was saying crashed into her. "Then why?" She choked out her voice, cracking, clear as throat. "Why did you do it? Why take us in? Why feed us?" G looked at the fire. For a moment, the hardened mountain man seemed to hesitate, the rough edges of his demeanor softening under the flickering orange light. "Because a town that watches a girl sell her soul for her kin and does nothing but bid on the meat." G paused, his jaw tightening. "That ain't a place fit for dogs, let alone people." He looked back at her. The emptiness she had seen in his eyes at the auction was gone. In its place was a quiet, enduring decency. "You're safe here," G said softly. "Sleep." Christa stood there as G turned and walked toward the door to check the heavy iron latch for the night. The dam inside her, the iron wall she had built to survive the last 4 days, finally cracked. The tears she had fought so hard to suppress on the auction block spilled over. She sank to her knees on the wooden floorboards, burying her face in her hands, and for the first time since her father died. She wept. She wept until her chest ached, the sound muffled by the crackling fire. G did not tell her to stop. He did not ask her to be quiet. He simply sat back down in his chair, keeping watch over the cabin, letting her cry out the poison of the world below. Snow locked the world away. By the third morning, drifts reached the lower windowsills, sealing the cabin in a silent white tomb. Inside, a strange, tense domesticity took root. G had relinquished his heavy, fur-lined bed to Christa, and Toby, pulling a canvas bedroll onto the stones near the hearth for himself. Sam, fiercely proud and still suspicious, claimed the floor near the door. Christa had tried to argue about the bed. G simply dropped his blankets on the rocks, turned his back, and went out to chop wood. That was the end of the debate. Christa refused to be a burden. If she was not his captive, she would be his partner in survival. She took over the hearth entirely. She baked dense loaves of sourdough, patched the fraying elbows of G's heavy canvas shirts, and kept the iron stove fed with pine knots. She worked with a frantic, nervous energy, scrubbing the floorboards until her knuckles bled. She was waiting for the trap to spring. Her cynicism was a hard-earned armor. Men did not give away $80 in gold out of the goodness of their hearts. Down in Black Creek, charity was just a debt with a hidden interest rate. G let her work. He didn't offer praise, but he didn't interfere. He was a man of economical movement and sparse words. He left before dawn to check trap lines and returned at dusk, smelling of pine sap, cold wind, and animal musk. He brought back rabbits, snowshoe hares, and once the heavy hind quarters of an elk. He dropped the meat on the table, cleaned his rifle, and sat by the fire. The silence between them was an ocean. Christa didn't know how to swim in it. She was used to dodging the drunken shouts of her father or the greasy threats of Jebediah Rooker. G's quiet was heavy, but it lacked malice. It was the quiet of a mountain. Sam struggled the most. At 12, he felt the humiliating weight of his own uselessness. He sat by the window, whittling angry shards of wood with a dull pocket knife, glaring at G's broad back. One afternoon, the wind died down, leaving the air brittle and clear. G stood by the door, pulling on his heavy bear coat. He looked at Sam, who was scowling at the floor. "Boy," G said. Sam looked up, his jaw set. G grabbed a worn, single-shot .22 caliber rifle from the corner. He tossed it. Sam scrambled to catch the heavy wood and iron, fumbling but securing it against his chest. Rabbits are stripping the bark off the young aspens down the draw. G said, "You want to eat meat? You learn to kill it. Grab your coat." Sam's eyes widened. He looked at Christa. She wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and gave him a short, tight nod. Sam threw on his oversized coat and hurried, Clear's throat, out the door after the giant. Christa watched them from the frosted window. She saw G stop by a snowbank, adjusting Sam's grip on the rifle-tock. He didn't hover. He pointed to the tree-line, tapped Sam's shoulder, and stepped back. He was teaching the boy how to stand on his own 2 feet, not how to hide behind someone else's, a tight knot in Christ's chest, one she hadn't realized she was carrying, loosened by a fraction. When they returned hours later, Sam was freezing. His lips blue, but he held a pair of dead snowshoe hares by their hind legs. His chest was puffed out. He dropped them on the table with a loud, satisfying thud. "Got him on the run," Sam said, his voice cracking with pride. G hung his coat on the peg. He shot clean. Didn't ruin the meat. It was the highest compliment G could offer. Sam beamed, taking the knife Christa handed him to begin skinning. That night, after the boys were asleep, Christa sat by the fire, mending a tear in Toby's trousers. G sat in his rocking chair, oiling a steel trap. The fire cast long, dancing shadows against the log walls. "Thank you," Christa said softly, not looking up from her needle. G paused his rag. "For what?" "Sam, he needed that. He felt like he failed us when P died. He needed to feel like a man." "He ain't a man," G replied flatly. "He's a boy holding a gun, but he's got a steady eye. He'll learn." Christa bit the thread, tying it off. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The firelight caught the silver streaks in his dark beard, the deep lines carved around his eyes by years of squinting into the sun and snow. He was formidable, dangerous. But as he wiped down the steel jaws of the trap, his hands were meticulously gentle. "Why do you live up here?" she asked. It was the first personal question she had dared to voice. G didn't answer immediately. He set the trap down and stared into the flames. "Down there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Men crowd together so they can pick each other's pockets and tell each other lies. Up here, The mountain don't lie. It kills you, or it lets you live. I prefer honest terms. He looked at her, his grey eyes piercing the dim light. You're waiting for me to ask for my due. Christa stiffened, her breath hitched. Are you? No, G said. He stood up, towering in the small room. He walked to his bedroll and laid down, pulling the heavy blanket over his shoulders. I told you once, I don't buy people. Go to sleep, Christa. She sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the wind, realizing that for the first time in her life, she was not afraid of the man in the room with her. January brought a bitter, snapping cold that made the cabin timbers groan like a ship at sea. The moisture froze right out of the air, leaving a dry, stinging chill that burned the lungs. G left 2 hours before dawn to check a trap line high on the northern ridge. He told them to keep the fire stoked and not to open the door for anything. By noon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. By 3:00, a white-out blizzard descended, erasing the trees, the woodpile, and the mountain itself. Christa paced the length of the cabin. She threw another log on the fire, her stomach twisting into cold, hard knots. She told herself she was worried about their survival. If G died out there, she and the boys would starve or freeze within weeks. But as the hours dragged on and the wind screamed against the roof, she realized her fear was not purely selfish. She pictured his heavy coat buried under a drift. She pictured those steady grey eyes frozen shut. It made her feel sick. Toby sat by the window watching the swirling white chaos. Is he coming back? He's coming back, Christa said, her voice sharp. She forced herself to soften it. He knows the mountain, Toby. He'll be fine. Twilight came plunging this cabin into near darkness. Still, the door remained shut. Christa put the boys to bed. She didn't sleep. She sat in the rocking chair, staring at the heavy iron latch, a hunting knife gripped tightly in her hand. She didn't know what she planned to fight. The storm. Just past midnight, a heavy thud rattled the door. Christa jumped to her feet. The latch lifted, and the door shoved open against a wall of snow. G stumbled inside, bringing a violent blast of freezing wind with him. He kicked the door shut behind him and slumped against the heavy timber, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. He was covered in snow. But that wasn't what made Christa drop the knife. The left sleeve of his heavy canvas shirt was shredded, and a dark, terrifying stain was spreading rapidly down his arm, dripping onto the floorboards. Gee! Christa gasped, rushing forward. He pushed himself off the door, swaying on his feet. Boiled water. He rasped, his teeth gritted. Needle thread. He didn't make it to the chair. He collapsed onto his knees, his massive frame shaking. Christa caught him by the good shoulder, dragging him towards the hearth. He was heavy, like trying to drag a fallen oak, but adrenaline flooded her veins. She got him to the stones near the fire. Sam! Clear's throat. Christa screamed. Wake up! Get the iron pot! Fill it with snow! Move! Sam scrambled out of bed, instantly wide awake. He grabbed the pot and shoved it out the door into the drift, bringing it back, packed with snow and slamming it onto the hot stove. Christa knelt beside G. His face was grey, slick with cold sweat. She grabbed his hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the ruined fabric of his sleeve, peeling it back. She inhaled sharply. It was a vicious, tearing wound. 3 jagged lacerations digging deep into the meat of his bicep. Cat grunted. His eyes squeezed shut. Cougar jumped. Clear's throat me from a ledge, got my knife in its ribs. But it got a piece of me first. You're bleeding too fast, Christa said. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was dead calm. She ripped a clean towel from the wash basin, wading it up and pressing it hard against the gashes. G let out a low, guttural groan, his head falling back against the stone hearth. "Hold this," Christa ordered Sam, guiding his small hands over hers, pressing them down on the bloody towel. "Do not let up. Push as hard as you can." She ran to the stove. The snow was melting into boiling water. She grabbed G's sewing kit from the shelf, thick black thread and a curved leather needle. She dropped the needle into the boiling water to clean it, splashing her own hands, ignoring the burn. She grabbed a bottle of raw whiskey from the cupboard. She went back to the hearth. "Sam, get Toby back in bed. Turn around." She pulled the soaked towel away. The blood welled up instantly. She unspooled the whiskey, pouring a heavy splash directly onto the open wounds. G's eyes flew open. He seized her wrist with his good hand, his grip like a steel vice. He didn't scream, but the cords in his neck stood out like ropes. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice dropping an octave. She stared right into his wild, pained eyes. "Let me do this." He stared back, chest heaving slowly, his grip on her wrist loosened. He released her and grabbed the leg of the heavy oak table instead, his knuckles turning white. Christa threaded the needle. Her hands stopped shaking. She had sewn torn dresses, patched canvas, and stitched up horse flanks on her father's farm. She knew how to pull flesh together. She pinched the edges of the deepest gash and pushed the curved needle through his thick skin. It cleared his throat, took 30 minutes. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the howling wind and G's shallow, ragged breathing. Christa worked with brutal efficiency, tying off thick, tight knots. She sewed him up like a torn sail. When she finished the last knot, she snipped the thread with her teeth. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with a bloody wrist. G's head was resting against the stones. He was watching her. The grey in his eyes was clouded with pain, but it was intensely focused on her face. She poured a cup of water and held it to his lips. He drank greedily. "You've got steady hands," he whispered hoarsely. "You're an idiot for walking in a whiteout," she fired back, her voice shaking now that it was over. She grabbed a clean rag and began wiping the blood from his forearm. "You could have died out there." "Wouldn't be the first time I tried," he said. Christa stopped wiping. She looked at him. Clear's throat. The sheer vulnerability of his statement hung in the air between them. He was not invincible. He was a man made of flesh and blood, living on the razor's edge of a hostile world. She didn't move away. She stayed kneeling beside him on the hearth, her knees soaked in his blood. Without thinking, she reached up and brushed a damp lock of dark hair away from his sweating forehead. It was the first time she had touched him with anything other than practical necessity. G closed his eyes, leaning into the touch for a fraction of a second before his exhaustion pulled him under. He passed out on the stones. Christa didn't sleep in the bed that night. She pulled a blanket over him, added 2 massive logs to the fire, and sat on the floor beside him, watching his chest rise and fall until the grey light of dawn finally broke through the frost. The infection set in on the 3rd day. Christa knew the signs. She had watched her mother die of blood poisoning from a rusty nail. It started with a heavy, unnatural heat radiating from the skin, followed by the angry red streaks creeping up the veins. G didn't wake up at dawn. He lay on his back. The heavy wool blankets kicked off his skin slick with a cold, greasy sweat. His breathing was shallow and fast. Christa touched his forehead and snatched her hand back. He was burning alive. She peeled back the bandages. The flesh around the deep lacerations was swollen, angry and tight. A foul, sweet smell of rotting meat hit her nose. "Sam," Christa said. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. Panic would get them killed. "Take the axe. Do not come back inside until you have a stack of dry wood. high as my waist. Toby filled the bucket with snow. "Keep it coming." She grabbed the knife. She had to open the stitches. She didn't use whiskey this time. She couldn't afford to waste it, and the pain wouldn't matter. G was already gone, trapped in a delirious maze of fever dreams. She cut the black threads, wincing as the skin pulled apart. She boiled water, packing it with coarse rock salt, and began to scrub the infection out of his arm. G thrashed. He threw his good arm out, catching Christa in the chest and knocking her backward into the table. He was weak, but his body was still a massive corded engine of muscle. "Hold him!" Christa shouted to Sam, who had just dropped a load of wood by the stove. Sam didn't hesitate. The boy threw his entire weight across G's chest, pinning his good arm down. Christa scrambled back, grabbed the hot, salted cloth, and pressed it deep into the open wounds. G roared. It was a raw animal sound that shook the dust from the rafters. His eyes snapped open, but they saw nothing. They were wide, unblinking, and entirely wild. "Let him go!" G shouted, his voice cracking. "Cut the rope. Cut it or we both go down." Christa froze the bloody cloth in her hand. G was staring right through her, pleading with ghosts. "I won't let you," G rasped, his head thrashing against the stones. "Elias, give me your hand." The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had come. His head lulled to the side. He muttered something incomprehensible, the name Elias, slipping from his cracked lips one last time before his eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Christa stood there, her chest heaving. The mountain man had secrets. The emptiness she had seen in his eyes at the auction wasn't a void. It was a grave. Someone named Elias was buried there. For the next 4 days, Christa did not sleep. She became the master of the cabin. She managed the fire, rationing the split wood with ruthless efficiency. She boiled snow for water. She took the small .22 rifle and shot 2 ptarmigans that dared to land on the snowdrifts near the window, butchering them on the oak table and boiling them down into a thin, greasy broth. She forced the broth down G's throat a spoonful at a time. Half of it dribbled down his beard, but she wiped his face and forced him to swallow the rest. She packed his arm with a drawing pus made of boiled pine resin and the last of the salt pork. The cabin smelled of sickness, wood smoke, and stale sweat. Sam chopped wood until his hands bled, wrapping his palms in torn rags and going right back out into the freezing wind. Toby kept the floors swept and the water buckets full. They operated as a unit bound together by the terrifying knowledge that if the giant in the bed died, the mountain would swallow them next. On the evening of the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a stark blue light across the snow. Christa sat in the rocking chair, a damp rag in her hand. She was skeletal. Dark purple bags hung beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled constantly from exhaustion. She looked at G. His chest was rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She reached out and laid the back of her hand against his cheek. The blistering heat was gone. His skin was cool and damp. The fever had broken. Christa let out a long, shuddering breath. She slumped back into the wooden rocker. The adrenaline that had kept her upright for 96 hours finally bleeding out of her veins. She closed her eyes, intending to rest for just 5 minutes. She slept for 14 hours. G woke to the sound of dripping water. It was a slow, steady plink-plink against the roof shingles. He opened his eyes. Sunlight, impossibly bright, was streaming through the frosted window pane, cutting a golden rectangle across the floorboards. His mouth tasted like copper and ashes. He tried to swallow, but his throat was sandpaper. He shifted his weight, and a sharp, pulling agony flared in his left arm. He looked down. His arm was bound tightly, and clean strips of cotton. He slowly turned his head. The cabin was immaculate. A massive stack of firewood was neatly piled by the stove. The iron pot was simmering with beans. The floor was swept, and slouched in the rocking chair, fast asleep, was Christa. She looked terrible. Her face was hollowed out, her hair a tangled mess, her hands stained with dried blood and pine sap. She was wearing his heavy flannel shirt, curled in on herself for warmth. G stared at her. He remembered the cougar. He remembered the snow. He remembered the blinding white heat of the fever, the feeling of being dragged underwater by dead hands. But weaving through the nightmare was a constant grounding force, a voice ordering him to drink, a cool hand on his burning forehead, a fierce, unrelenting will that refused to let him die. He gripped the edge of the hearth and pushed himself up. His legs felt like hollow reeds. The room spun wildly, tilting on its axis. He ground his teeth, forcing his boots to the floor. He stood. He swayed, taking a clumsy, heavy step toward the table. His knee buckled. He hit the floorboards with a heavy crash. Christa jerked awake, gasping. She scrambled out of the chair, the hunting knife in her hand, before her eyes even focused. She saw G on the floor, trying to push himself up with his good arm. "You stupid, stubborn mule!" she snapped, dropping the knife and rushing to his side. She grabbed him under his right arm, planting her feet and pulling with all her might. "Get up. Come on." G leaned into her, letting her bear his weight. She was so small, but her grip was iron. She guided him to the heavy oak chair by the table and eased him down into it. He sat there, chest heaving, waiting for the grey spots to clear from his vision. He looked up at her. She stood over him, hands on her hips, her eyes flashing with anger and exhaustion. "If you tear those stitches, I'll sew them back together with rusty wire," she warned him, her voice trembling slightly. G looked around the cabin. He looked at the neatly stacked wood. He looked at the iron pot. He looked at the two boys who were peeking out from the canvas divider, watching him with wide, cautious eyes. "You held the mountain," Clear's throat, G said softly. Christa crossed her arms. "Someone had to. You could have let me die." He met her gaze, his grey eyes clear and piercing. "You could have taken the rifle, the mules and the gold in my footlocker. You could have waited for the pass to clear and left." "And go where?" Christa asked bitterly. "Back to Black Creek. Back to Rooker. I told you I pay my debts." G shook his head slowly. "That wasn't a debt, Christa. That was grace." She didn't know what to say to that. The word sounded strange coming from his rough, bearded mouth. It disarmed her. The anger melted out of her posture, leaving only the bone-deep weariness. "Drink this," she muttered, turning to the stove. She poured a mug of warm water and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed against the tin. G didn't pull away immediately. He looked at her hands, the blisters, the cuts, the permanent stains of hard labor. He saw the exact same resilience that had kept her standing on that auction block. "The snow is melting," Sam said from the window. Christa and G both looked. The boy was right. The brutal, suffocating grip of winter was loosening. Large chunks of ice were sliding off the eaves, crashing into the drifts below. The dark green needles of the pines were beginning to show through the white. Spring was coming. For the next 2 weeks, the thaw accelerated. The mountain shed its snow like a heavy coat, revealing a landscape of churning mud, rushing creeks, and pale green shoots pushing through the dead earth. G healed quickly. The infection was completely gone, leaving thick, puckered pink scars across his bicep. He began to regain his strength. venturing out further each day to check the traps that had been buried for months. The silence between them returned, but the texture of it had changed. It was no longer tense. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. They moved around each other in the small cabin with the fluid grace of people who knew exactly where the other was. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks and painted the sky in streaks of bruised purple, G sat on the porch step, carving a new stock for Sam's .22 rifle. Christa stepped out the door, wiping a plate with a dishcloth. The air was cool, smelling of wet dirt and pine needles. She sat on the wooden barrel next to him. "The trail to town," G said, not looking up from his knife. "It's passable now. The mud's drying up." Christa's hand stopped moving. The cloth dropped to her lap. A cold spike of dread drove itself into her stomach. "Are you sending us back?" she asked. Her voice was flat, trying desperately to hide the sudden absolute terror that seized her throat. G stopped carving. He slowly lowered the knife. He turned his head and looked at her. "No," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made her heart stutter. "I'm asking if you want to go." Christa stared at him. The valley below was a world of debt cruelty and men who looked at her like a piece of meat. The mountain was harsh, cold, and unforgiving. But the mountain didn't lie. And the man sitting next to her, bleeding and scarred, had given her the one thing no one in Black Creek ever had. He gave her a choice. Before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed up from the valley. G stood up instantly, the half-carved wood dropping to the dirt. He grabbed the porch rail, his eyes scanning the tree iron far below. "That wasn't a branch breaking," Christa said, her breath catching. "No, G," said, his jaw tightening into a hard line. He stepped back inside and pulled the Henry repeating rifle down from the wall above the door. He checked the action, a sharp metallic click that shattered the quiet evening. "It was a gunshot," he said. "Someone's coming up the trail." G did not waste a single movement. He shoved the heavy wooden door shut, sliding the thick iron bolt home with a sharp final clang. He turned to Christa. The relaxed, quiet man on the porch was gone, replaced instantly by the cold, calculated hunter she had met in Black Creek. "Get the boys," G ordered his voice, a flat, dead calm. "Behind the stone hearth. Keep your heads down and do not make a sound. Understand?" Christa didn't argue. She grabbed Sam by the collar and pulled Toby by the wrist, shoving them behind the massive stone structure of the fireplace. It was the only part of the cabin that could stop a heavy-caliber bullet. She huddled over them, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked back just in time to see G slide the barrel of the Henry rifle through a narrow, shuttered gun port beside the front door. Outside, the squelch of horse hooves, tearing through the thawing mud, grew louder. 3 riders broke through the tree iron, pulling up at the edge of the clearing. Christa peered through a crack in the chinking. She felt the blood drain from her face. Sitting at top, a large Rangeeling, was Jebediah Rooker. He wore a heavy canvas duster over his suit, his bowler hat pulled low against the evening glare. Flanking him were 2 men Christa didn't recognize, hard-eyed drifters with low-slung gun belts, and the ragged feral look of men who killed for cheap liquor. Sullivan Rooker shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. It sounded thin and reedy up here, stripped of the unearned authority he wielded in town. "I know you're in there. Smoke's in the chimney." G didn't answer. The silence from the cabin was heavy. "Absolute, now don't be unably," Rooker called out, shifting in his saddle. "I ain't come all this way up a muddy track just to talk to a wooden door. We have some unsettled business." G leaned slightly, speaking through the gun port without exposing himself. "We settled our business in November, Rooker. You're trespassing." Rooker laughed, a dry, nervous sound. Well, that's the thing about business, Sullivan. It changes. I got to looking at my ledgers. The girl's daddy owed a lot more than $80. Turns out there was interest, penalties, and the boys. Well, the county orphanage is mighty upset they were stolen away. There's a bounty on returning them. It was a lie, a sloppy, desperate lie. Christa pressed her hand over Toby's mouth to muffle his frightened whimpering. Rooker hadn't climbed a mountain for back taxes. He had spent the winter thinking about the heavy leather pouch G pulled those gold double eagles from. Clear's throat. He brought 2 gunmen to take the rest of it. Turn the horses around. Rooker. G's voice rumbled, carrying a dark final warning. I won't say it twice. Rooker's greasy smile faded. He nodded slightly to the man on his right. Take the door. The drifter kicked his horse forward, drawing a heavy revolver. He never cleared the leather. The Henry rifle cracked like a thunderclap. A plume of white smoke jetted from the gun port. The drifter jerked violently backward, a dark hole appearing dead center in his chest. He tumbled out of the saddle, hitting the mud with a wet, heavy thud. His horse reared, screaming in panic, and bolted back into the trees. Chaos erupted. The second gunman spurred his horse sideways, firing blindly at the cabin. Heavy lead slugs tore through the pine logs, splintering wood and showering the interior with lethal shards. Christa covered the boys with her own body, squeezing her eyes shut as the deafening roar of gunfire filled the small room. G didn't flinch. He worked the lever of the Henry with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. He tracked the moving horseman through the narrow slit. He fired twice. The first shot missed, kicking up a spray of mud. The second caught the horse in the shoulder. The animal collapsed, sending the rider pitching forward over its neck. The drifter hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop near the wood pile. He scrambled to his knees, raising his pistol, but G was already there. He kicked the front door open, stepping out onto the porch into the line of fire. The drifter fired. The bullet tore through the canvas of G's shirt, grazing his ribs. But the mountain man didn't slow down. He raised the Henry to his shoulder and fired once. The drifter's head snapped back, and he crumpled into the dirt. 2 men dead in under 10 seconds. Silence slammed back down on the clearing, ringing in Christ's ears like a bell. Thick, acrid gunpowder smoke drifted through the open doorway. Rooker was still on his horse, frozen in absolute terror. He had expected a cowering trapper. He had walked into a slaughterhouse. His hand hovered over his own pistol, shaking violently. G racked the lever of the Henry one last time. He leveled the barrel at Rooker's chest and walked slowly down the porch steps. "Wait!" Rooker gasped, dropping his hands, his face utterly pale. "Sullivan, wait. We can talk about this. I got money. You got 10 seconds to run," G said. The emptiness was back in his eyes, the terrifying, hollow stare that promised nothing but violence. Rooker didn't hesitate. He yanked the reins hard, wheeling the roan geeling around. He dug his spurs in, brutally fleeing toward the tree-line without looking back. G stood in the mud, watching the coward run. Clear's throat. He didn't lower the rifle. He tracked Rooker's retreating back. Slowly, his finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it right here. He could put a bullet between Rooker's shoulder blades, and the valley would be entirely free of a parasite. Gee, the voice was soft, but it cut through the red haze in his mind. He turned his head. Christa was standing on the porch. She had left the boys inside. Her hands were shaking her face, stray with dust and gunpowder residue, but she stood tall. She looked at the dead men in the mud, and then she looked at him. "Let him go," she said. "He won't come back. He knows what lives up here now." G stared at her. The tension in his massive shoulders slowly uncoiled. He lowered the rifle, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He walked back to the porch, his boots heavy in the wet earth. He stopped on the bottom step, looking up at the woman who had just pulled him back from the edge of murder. He nodded once. The reckoning was over. They buried the two drifters at the far edge of the clearing, where the pines met the rock wall. G dug the graves himself, ignoring the shallow graze on his ribs. He didn't mark the mounds. Men who came up the mountain to rob and kill didn't earn names in the dirt. By the time he finished, the sun had dropped below the peaks, leaving the cabin bathed in the cold blue light of early dusk. He washed the mud and blood from his hands at the pump, wincing as the icy water hit his torn skin. When he walked inside, the cabin was warm. The shattered wood from the doorframe had been swept up. The bullet holes in the logs were patched with mud and pine pitch. The table was set. It was a mundane and domestic scene that sat in stark contrast to the extreme violence that had just occurred outside. Christa was at the stove dishing out a heavy elk stew. Sam and Toby were at the table, quiet, their eyes wide and respectful, as G walked past them. They had seen what he was capable of. They had seen the monster he kept chained in his chest, but they didn't look afraid of him. They looked at him the way one looks at a high stone wall during a storm, with absolute reliance. "Sit," Christa said, pointing to the chair. G sat. She brought him a plate and a cup of black coffee. She noticed the fresh blood seeping through his torn shirt. Without a word, she grabbed a clean towel and a bottle of iodine from the shelf. "Lift your arm," she ordered. He obeyed. She unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the shallow trench the bullet had carved across his ribs. She cleaned it with steady, practiced hands. The sting of the iodine was sharp, but G didn't flinch. He just watched her face. The hollow exhaustion that had plagued her all winter was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce strength. "You didn't answer my question on the porch," G said quietly so the boys wouldn't hear. Christa paused, the iodine bottle hovering in her hand. She looked at the fresh graze, then up to the thick, puckered scars on his bicep from the cougar. He bore the marks of a brutal world, but every single one of them was a testament to his sheer will to survive. "About going back?" she asked, setting the bottle down. "About the choice," he corrected. "Rooker is gone. The debt is dead. You owe me nothing, Christa. If you want a life down there, a normal life, I'll take you down tomorrow. I'll give you enough gold to start over in a town when nobody knows your name." Christa took a step back. She looked around the cabin. She saw the heavy oak table they ate at every night. She saw the hearth where she had fought a fever for his life. She looked at her brothers who had color in their cheeks and meat on their bones. Then she looked at G, a normal life. She repeated a bitter, cynical smile, touching the corner of her lips. "I lived a normal life down there. G, normal is watching your father drink away the crop money. Normal is standing on a whiskey barrel while a dozen men bid on your body. Normal is starving." She walked back to him, closing the distance. She didn't look at the floor anymore. She met his steel-grey eyes directly. "You think I want to go back to a world that buys and sells people?" she asked softly. "You think I want to leave the only place I've ever actually felt safe?" G stared at her, his expression unreadable, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "It ain't an easy life up here. It's just cold and work and dirt." "I don't mind the dirt," Christa said. "And I don't mind the work as long as the work is mine." She reached out her small, calloused hand, resting gently against his chest, right over his heart. She felt the heavy, steady thud of it against her palm. Clear's throat. "I'm not your property, G. Sullivan," she whispered. "I'm your partner, if you'll have me." The mountain man closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, The last remnants of the isolating ice he had carried for years finally shattered. He didn't offer a flowery declaration of love. He didn't make grand, empty promises. He simply lifted his massive, scarred hand and placed it over hers, pressing her palm firmly against his chest. "I'll have you," he rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in a decade. "I'll have you, Christa." They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The understanding between them was forged in fire blood and the brutal winter of the high country. It was stronger than romance. It was survival, chosen and shared. Spring finally broke over the mountain. The clear's throat mud dried into hard, packed earth. The pines pushed out bright green needles, and the wild colline bloomed in the shade of the rocks. Down in the valley, the town of Black Creek continued its slow decay, a hive of desperate people clawing at each other in the dirt, but high above them, where the air, clear's throat, was thin and honest. Smoke rose steadily from a stone chimney. The trap lines were full, the wood was stacked high, and the door was bolted tight. They belonged to the mountain now, and the mountain belonged to them. If you felt the heartbreak and hope in Christa and G's story, don't leave without hitting that like button. Their journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next in the snowy mountains. Share this video with a friend who loves gritty, emotional Western romances, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next part drops. What did you think of G's stand at the auction? Let me know in the comments below.